Good evening. Well, my name is Stephen Allison, and I'm the coordinator of the Edinburgh Solas group who have organised tonight's event. It's great to see so many of you here this evening, where this is an unusual event for us because we have Solas and politicians on both sides, which quite often doesn't often happen. But we have Richard Lucas from Solas, heavily involved in the Edinburgh group and has taken part in a lot of our debates. And we have David Robertson from Solas, who is the director of Solas nationally. And so both of them are on opposite sides this evening. And I think this is the first time they've been in a debate together. Yeah? So they're quite excited about that. And we also are privileged to have Murdo, Fraser and John Mason, MSP, here to also put forward perhaps a more political side. Knowing David, probably not. Maybe David will be the most political this evening. But we've got Christians represented on both sides to try and look at this issue of independence. And as we get into the last kind of 100 days leading up to the referendum, we thought it was a great time to bring together this event and to get different perspectives, but coming together and probably showing how a debate should be conducted. And maybe not. But I did like the fact that Murdo and John were prepared to share a table downstairs for their leaflets on the same table. So they're doing all right. But yeah, we've got Will Clayton here tonight, who's going to chair tonight's debate. It'll last for approximately 2 hours, and I'll tell you some stuff at the end, but there's refreshments afterwards, and do stick around. But I'll just hand over to Will now, and we'll get started.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and especially to Charlotte Chapel for hosting tonight's debate. As Stephen said, hopefully it'll provide a different take on Scottish independence, a Christian take. And confirming that giving the Christian perspective in favour of the Union tonight, we have Murdo Fraser, Conservative MSP, and Richard Lucas from the Solas Centre for Public Christianity, and arguing the Christian case for independence, John Mason, SNP MSP, and David Robertson, who is the director for the Solas Centre of Public Christianity. Tonight's debate is split into two parts. The first part will contain just contributions from the speakers. The second part will involve you as well. The timings for tonight are as follows. Each speaker will make a 10-minute uninterrupted speech, with John going first, followed by Murdo, then David, and then Richard. Following these four speeches, each panellist will have the opportunity to ask one question to the other side, with discussion ensuing. At around 8:30, the audience, that's you lot, will then be given the opportunity to come forward and ask questions to the panellists. I should stress at this point, please, that it is questions we are looking for, not speeches, rants, diatribes, personal attacks, or anything that goes on for more than about a minute, if I could please ask that. And I will be inviting two questions at the time to give the panellists choice of what they want to talk about and what they want to discuss. I would also ask, please, that the questions, where possible, focus on the Christian aspect of the debate. That's the unique aspect of tonight's event, and it would be good to get more development in that area. Following the audience questions, in reverse speaking order from the initial speeches, we will have a 2-minute closing statement from each speaker, and then Stephen will round up the event as a whole. There will be no vote tonight. So without any further ado, I'd like to welcome John Mason to open the case. From this side. Yes, please.
Well, good evening, and many thanks for the opportunity to be here with you this evening. I think Murdo and I have been doing a kind of tour, and we've had 6 debates, just him and myself, in various churches around Scotland. So this is the 7th, and it's the first time we've had support, or if that's what it is, we'll see. Just a little bit of my own background. I was brought up in a Church of Scotland in Rutherglen, just outside Glasgow. I came to a personal faith through Scripture Union when I was about 14. I'm an accountant. I had 2 years with Operation Mobilisation down south, and then 3 years in Nepal with Interserve. And it was partly when I was there that I began to think that there's Nepal, a little country with 2 big neighbours, India and China, and yet they're very proud to be independent. And I also met people from New Zealand who didn't like being confused with the Australians, and Canada who didn't want to be run by the Americans. And I began to think, well, maybe Scotland could be independent. So I've changed over my lifetime. In 1998, I became a councillor in Glasgow for 10 years. Then for 2 years, I was down at Westminster as an MP, and for the last 3 years, I've been in the Scottish Parliament, and currently I'm a member of Easterhouse Baptist Church. So why do I want independence? Well, I think fundamentally for me, it's about standing on your own 2 feet and making your own decisions. When I was in my early 20s, I was staying with my parents. I got on reasonably okay with them, but I just really wanted to get into a flat on my own or with a friend and make my own decisions, decide when I came in at night, all of these kind of things, the big decisions and the little decisions. And I didn't know what the future held. When I took my first mortgage, I knew it was a bit of a risk. If the interest rates went up beyond 15%, I knew I was going to be struggling. But lo and behold, I did manage to live on my own and survived. And I suppose I would argue that I have benefited from living on my own. I'm still single, actually, but making my own decisions, doing things. And in fact, the interesting thing was I think I got on better with my parents after I had left home and we were living in different houses. And I think there can be a parallel there. Alex Salmond has said if Scotland gets independence, England would lose a surly lodger and gain a good neighbour. And I think that fits very well. Now, does God have an answer on this? Is God voting yes or no in this referendum? I think the answer is the Bible doesn't say. I don't believe that there is a right answer from a Christian perspective on this question. There are committed Christians in all the main political parties, and there are committed Christians on both sides of this debate. And whatever else we do, I hope you'll pray for Scotland and pray for the referendum. I think we can accept that Christians can disagree on issues like this, but still get on with each other okay. And the very fact we're having a friendly debate tonight, hopefully, is a witness as part of the church. And I think whether we have independence or not, I see Scotland, the UK, the Western world becoming increasingly secular. That's not maybe something we all welcome, but it seems to me to be the background of where we're going. If I can just mention a couple of things too along the way. One is this book called Honey from the Lion by Doug Gay, who's a Christian committed to Scottish independence. And he's arguing that it's okay for a Christian to support independence and nationalism. And also we have a group, there's leaflets downstairs called Christians for Independence. And again, that's just to show that it is possible to be a Christian and to be a supporter of Scottish independence. What kind of Scotland do we want to see? Well, there has been some good work done on this, and if you're from a Church of Scotland background, you might have seen this, Our Vision, Imagining Scotland's Future. And there's some good stuff in here. It talks about the values we'd like to see in Scotland, whether we're independent or not. Equality, fairness, justice, education, respect, honesty, community opportunity, compassion, tolerance, all things which I think we would welcome. And also the Evangelical Alliance has done this report, What Kind of Nation? And they focus on the values on the mace in the Parliament: wisdom, justice, compassion, integrity. And again, I think we could sign up. But if I just take two of these, the first two in the Church of Scotland paper, equality and fairness. We live in a very unequal society, whether that be Scotland, the UK, or even the whole world. Recently we had the Sunday Times Rich List saying that the 100 richest people in Scotland have £25 billion of assets. And if I want one thing in politics as well as independence, it would be to have a more equal and a more fair society. Recently we've had examples like the bedroom tax, like the welfare reforms, which have made our society even more polarised, even more unequal. And also I think an independent Scotland can be an example as a nation in giving assistance to other poorer parts of the world. Malawi, that's already happening to a small extent. But I think there is widespread support in Scotland for things like fair trade, better taxation systems, international companies actually paying their tax, which they haven't been. So my starting point, again, is that I'm very unsatisfied with where we are, with where the UK is. The UK has had the chance for 300 years to create a kind of fair society that we're all comfortable in living in, and my argument would be the UK has failed in that regard. We need to have something better. I want something better. We need to have ambition. We need to have confidence. Can we forecast the future? No, the answer is no, and I think we can give a clear Christian answer to that there is no, none of us know the future, what's coming up. Nobody knows what income tax will be in 10 years' time, whether we're independent or whether we're in the UK. Nobody knows whether we'll still be in the European Union if we're in the UK. I would suggest it's very likely we'd still be in it if we are independent. But on day one, what we can say, we start off in the same position as the rest of the UK, same currency, same tax rates, same Queen, same relationship with the EU. And then we can decide if we can make things better and how we can do that. And I think we get some sense of direction, some of the things that have already happened since devolution, since 1999. The NHS down south has become increasingly private, more and more privatisation, quite expensive charges for prescriptions. In Scotland, we've kept the NHS in the public sector and free prescriptions. Same with student fees. We've actually maintained the position that the UK used to have of free education, even if you're from a poorer background. And whereas in England, student fees and if you're from a poorer background, maybe you can't afford to get to university at all. So we get some sense of direction, I think, as to where Scotland might go if we were independent. Other things being like opposition to Trident, which I think is quite widespread in Scotland. And I think I would argue that independent Scotland would be slightly to the left of where Westminster has been. Can we afford independence? Absolutely yes. Over the last 5 years, Scotland has been £8.3 billion better off than the rest of the UK. That works out about £1,600 per person. We pay less for welfare and benefits and pensions than the rest of the UK does as a proportion of our income or of our public expenditure. And our public expenditure in Scotland is proportionately less than it is in the rest of the UK as a proportion of GDP. What would the place of a Christian faith be in an independent Scotland? Well, as I said already, I think we're becoming increasingly secular. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think the church has tended to do well when it has not been very close to the state, as has been the case for the last few hundred years. So I am very optimistic about where the church can be, frankly, whether we're independent or not. But I think things may get more difficult for the churches, again, whether we're independent or not. I think there's the opportunity of a written constitution and really laying it down that there must be freedom of religion in a written constitution and freedom to change religion. So I hope we can debate these things in a friendly manner. I note that the Church of Scotland is planning to have a reconciliation service right after the referendum vote. I suppose my hope is that we don't need a reconciliation service because we're all actually being quite friendly about this. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I'd now like to invite Murdo Fraser.
Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, first of all, very much for inviting me along tonight, along with my colleagues, to talk about this very important question. And first thing I would say is, on a warm night, it's great to see so many people coming here to discuss this important matter, because this question we're being asked in September the 18th, 98 days, I think it is, from now, is probably the most important political question anybody in this room will be asked to answer in their lifetimes. And therefore, I think we all need to approach that question as well informed as possible about the consequences of that vote. And I very much welcome the fact that Solus have organised tonight's debate, hopefully to leave us all better informed. John and I have, as John said, have done quite a number of these debates. I think so far they've been conducted, I hope, in a fairly good-tempered and good-natured and gracious manner. So if you've come along tonight expecting a rerun of the infamous TV clash between Joanne Lamont and Nicola Sturgeon, you're probably in the wrong place. Probably, although with Richard and David in the mix, who knows? We'll blame them if it all goes downhill. I've been a member of the Scottish Parliament for 13 years. I represent Mid-Scotland and Fife. Before that, I was a lawyer. I live in Perth. I'm married with a young family, and I'm a member, although not uncritically, of the Church of Scotland. And the first thing I would like to do is agree with something that John said, and because I don't think there is a particular Christian perspective on this debate, in that I think you can approach this debate as a Christian either for or against independence. And I think when you start to argue theologically on either side of the debate, you potentially run into difficulty. But I will be voting no in the referendum for a number of reasons, probably primarily because I think the family of nations that is the United Kingdom has overall been a success. And what we've done is we've brought together England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the United Kingdom has challenges, I accept that, as every country in the world has challenges. But I think we've achieved a lot together, whether that was in the 19th century being the leaders in the world of stamping out the slave trade, or in the 20th century coming together, creating a great institution that is the National Health Service, or coming together to defeat Nazi oppression, as we did in the Second World War, and we saw just last week the 70th anniversary of D-Day and the sacrifices made. Or in the current century, we are the world's second largest donor of foreign aid, and using that to spread influence throughout the world and the benefits of freedom, democracy and human rights. And you can say a lot of bad things about Britain, but one of the things that interests me is that we have this debate in the UK about immigration. Why do we have a debate about immigration? Because there are lots of people all over the world wanting to come and live here. And to me, that just demonstrates why Britain isn't such a bad place. And we are still a beacon for freedom, democracy and human rights across the world, despite the fact we are not as perfect as we would like to be. So I think we've done a lot in the past and we can continue to do a lot in the future. And to me, there are three key advantages from the UK. The first is economically, because we are a nation in Scotland of 5 million people, but we have a domestic market of 63 million people. And if you look at all the goods and services that are sold from companies in Scotland that go out with Scotland, something like 70% of those go to the rest of the UK. Only 30% go to the rest of the world. It's a huge domestic market. And anything that disrupts that market would be bad news. The second compelling reason is the question of social protection. Because to me, it makes more sense to share, for example, the cost of providing pensions across 63 million people in the UK than across 5 million people in Scotland, particularly when we know we've got a more rapidly ageing population in Scotland than the UK as a whole. And the third reason is to do with our place in the world, because as part of the UK, we are part of the world's sixth largest economy. We are, as I mentioned earlier, that the world's second largest donor of foreign aid. We are a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We are the second largest economy and the second largest donor to the EU, and we have a seat at the top table. We have far more influence as Scots in the world as part of the UK than we would have if we were independent. And you only have to look at Scottish history and UK history to see the great role that Scots have played in developing the world through the United Kingdom, whether that's in inventions or in exploration or in the world of business or the professions or in the world of politics, where in the last century there were no fewer than 6 Scots became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, far more than you'd expect from our population share. And of course, we can do things differently in Scotland. We have a Scottish Parliament. Already it can legislate in a whole range of areas. I think we have the best of both worlds. We've got a devolved Scottish Parliament here in Edinburgh, but we also have the strength and security of being part of the United Kingdom. And I think we also have to ask, what would an independent Scotland actually be like? Would it be different? How different would it be? Is it worth making that leap? John talked a lot about issues of equality, and I recognise inequality is a huge problem in Scotland, the UK, and the whole of the Western world. But where are the policies proposed in the Scottish Government's white paper to deal with that? Because there are no policies to redistribute tax from rich to poor, because these are hard decisions that have to be taken. And there's no evidence people in Scotland are any more likely to vote for these than people elsewhere in the UK. In fact, if you look at the tax proposals in the white paper, they propose cutting corporation tax for large businesses by 3 pence in the pound. Now, I put my hands up. I'm a Conservative. I don't object to the principle of cutting taxes where it can be afforded. But I don't think the priority should be to cut taxes for large corporations when other people could benefit. And when you look at personal taxes in the white paper, what is the one measure on personal tax that's proposed? It's not a proposal to raise the tax threshold, as the UK government, the current UK government has done, to take lower earners out of income tax. It's not a proposal to raise the top rate of tax for higher earners to redistribute wealth. The one personal tax amendment in the white paper is a proposal to scrap the married couples allowance. Now, I understand you can be critical of the married couples allowance, that it's too modest a proposal. It doesn't go far enough. But to have it as your single tax proposal, to get rid of the sole recognition in the tax system of the marriage state, which to me has been of great benefit to society for many centuries and should continue to be, is going entirely in the wrong direction. And we don't know what an independent Scotland would be like, but others see it as an opportunity. David Robertson's great friends in the Scottish Secular Society are actively campaigning for a yes vote in the referendum because they see this as an opportunity to create a more secular Scotland. I hope that wouldn't happen even if we get a yes vote, but it's interesting that they are on that side of the debate and not the other one. I just want to leave you with two final thoughts. The first is this: successful countries don't break up. It's very difficult looking for a precedent for what's happening in Scotland today. Lots of countries have divided and split up, but it's because they've come out of periods of oppression. That happened when the former Yugoslavia broke up, or the former Czechoslovakia broke up. They were coming out of a period of oppression, and they divided. You could even argue that's what happened when Ireland left the UK in the 1920s. The Irish people certainly felt they had been oppressed by the UK, and they left. It's very difficult to find a precedent for a successful partnership breaking up. But the only one I could find was when Norway voted to leave the Kingdom of Sweden in the early part of the 20th century. And of course, they'd only been together for 100 years. We've had a partnership for 307 years. Successful countries don't divide. And the final point is this. You hear a lot in this debate about arguments of the head, rational arguments about whether we'd be better off, whether we'd be poorer, whether we could do things differently. But there's also arguments of the heart. And I'm very proud to be a Scot, but I'm also proud to be British. And I think as Great Britain, we've done an awful lot together, and I feel being British is part of my identity. And one of the reasons I'll be voting no in the referendum is I don't want to see part of that identity taken away. And nobody who's a proud Scot today is going to feel any less of a proud Scot on the 19th of September if we carry on as we are. But if we vote yes on the 18th of September, I'm going to have part of my identity taken away from me. And my children, who currently have the right to carry a British passport, are going to lose that right in the future. And I don't want them to give that up. There are children all over the world who would give almost anything to have the right to carry a British passport with the privileges and freedoms that carries with it. I don't want to see that given up. No, I think the United Kingdom has got its challenges, but our best days are ahead of us, not behind us, and we should work out our problems together. I hope, however you plan to vote, that you will vote, because it is vitally important that we come to this vote in September. We have a resounding turnout, so the people of Scotland have their say, and we settle this issue one way or another. Thank you for coming and engaging, and please, whatever you do in September, make sure you go out and vote. Thank you.
Thank you to Murdo, and I'd now like to welcome David Robertson to continue from this side.
Okay, well, I'm probably going to argue from the heart. I was delighted. My heart leaped yet again to see Murdo moving to the left, which was encouraging. And I was shocked when I heard he was going to vote no. I'm kind of a bit fed up with this debate, to be honest. I'm kind of fed up of the pettiness and the childishness that, not this particular debate, but not yet, just in general. I listened to the news coming in, and two politicians, one Labour, one SNP, and I was just so depressed at the quality and the petty point scoring and everything. And I just think we kind of deserve better. I don't care if J.K. Rowling supports staying in the Union. I don't care if Sean Connery supports leaving, as does apparently President Putin. I don't care. And I don't care what President Obama says. I mean, it's all seems to me so petty, and I don't think it's going to be the end of the Western world if Scotland becomes independent. I don't care if we lose Doctor Who, and if we're going to lose Big Brother, then you all should vote yes. And I get fed up with people saying, if you're going to vote to stay in the Union, you're some kind of giving in to the imperialist English, and all that nonsense that comes out of some quarters of the Yes campaign. My concern is, to be honest, where we are as a nation spiritually, because I'm working on the basis that sin is a reproach to any people and righteousness exalts a nation. And that's what bothers me, whether in or out of the United Kingdom. Now, I have many reasons why I will be voting yes. I think, first of all, that Britain has passed its sell-by date. The United Kingdom was formed as a union of Protestant countries. I belong to a church which signed up to the Westminster Confession, which was drawn up to enable unity between the churches in the United Kingdom. And I think that's all gone. Christendom is dead, it's gone. When Michael Gove speaks of British values, I have no idea what he means, and I don't think he does either. Without Christianity, I don't think that exists. And so for me, Britain has passed its sell-by date. A second principle is simply this. I think we should govern ourselves. I feel entirely disconnected from Westminster and from London. I don't understand why we can spend 60 billion on shaving 25 minutes off the Birmingham to London rail fare, and at the same time, apparently, it's going to make Dundee poorer and also slower to get to, which I think is bizarre, because we should all be wanting to go to Dundee. But I do feel just completely disempowered. And I think that we've handed over the control of our nation, not really to Parliament, but to the City of London. And I want out of it. I don't want to be governed by London, great city as it is. I also have a belief that Scotland is a wealthy nation. And I'd like to see that nation being used for the good of the Scottish people and beyond that. I look at Norway with a great deal of envy. And I'm just concerned about how the oil wealth has been squandered and how, with our agriculture, industry, education, whisky, fishing and renewable energy, commerce and the arts and so on, we really don't have much control. I want to add a fourth reason. I think as a Christian, you've got to be concerned about the poor. And I don't see in our culture us going that way. I see us becoming more unequal, economically unequal, more socially unjust. I think in a smaller nation with a strong democratic tradition and less dependence on the City of London and big business, there's a greater prospect of a more just and equal society. And I also believe that the British establishment is becoming increasingly corrupt. And I'm not going to exempt Scotland from that, but for me, I think that we can have more say in what goes on in Scotland. But I think my main reason is this. I am unsatisfied where we're at spiritually. And I think the church will have more influence in an independent Scotland. I know my friends in secular Scotland have a heart attack about that, and I wish them well, and I pray for their healing. But when David Cameron speaks of Christian Britain with our Christian institutions and traditions, I don't believe him. I don't believe he actually knows what Christianity actually is. I think both Scotland and the UK are going downhill fast. I think we're in a new situation. I think Christendom has gone. I think the established churches are a dysfunctional mess, a pale, disintegrating shadow of their former selves. I think it will be easier for the church and Christians to have a say in a society which is not centred on the worship of mammon and which is a lot smaller. An independent Scotland will mean a new beginning. I guess the way I would want to conclude this is where I began. Sin is a reproach to any people, but righteousness exalts a nation. Of course it's not simple. Of course things are going to be complicated, and of course Alex Salmond and all the others are sinners. In an independent Scotland, we don't have to be governed by Alex Salmond either. Again, I hate all the personalisation of this. I am a little bit confused by people who warn about the evils of nationalism when it comes to Scotland, but are proud to be nationalists when it comes to Britain. All the arguments for the Better Together campaign would equally work if you said, why aren't we better together with Germany? Better together in the European Union? I think that there's an aspect of nationalism, as Vishal Mangalwadi says in his marvellous book, The Book That Made Your World, which, when combined together with Christianity, can be a force for redemption. Whatever happens, I'm going to work for the gospel to be proclaimed and spread in Scotland, England, or wherever. I don't care what country anybody is. And I think a lot of what we think in terms of countries is just human constructs anyway. But for practical reasons and for historical reasons, I don't see any reason to remain in a failing United Kingdom, to be governed by the City of London, when we could be free and when we could, in a more democratic, I believe, tradition, could have a greater opportunity to influence the nation for the gospel and then to influence other nations. There was a time when Scotland sent engineers and ministers and politicians and doctors all over the world. I think there's wonderful things in Scotland just now, but I still think that overall we are a failing nation in a union, in a failed union. And for that reason, I would like a new start, a rebirth. I'd like Scotland to be born again. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And our final speaker tonight is Richard.
Also extend a welcome to tonight's debate. I've certainly found it interesting so far, and I'm sure the rest of the evening will be similarly stimulating. Now, I'd like to start going back to absolute basics on this question by looking at a couple of definitions. First of all, a nation. A nation is a group of people sharing culture, language, history, territory, and/or religion. And that leads them to feel a sense of community, which leads to a subjective sense of national identity. A state, on the other hand, is a political entity, uniting people under an authority structure in a territory, protecting and providing for them. Loyalty to the state flows from the same reasons as to a nation, but also from more objective reasons. A state provides things for us: security, healthcare, education, etc. So we should feel a proper sense of gratitude and duty to our state and responsibility to all of its citizens. Now, a nation may or may not be a state, and a nation may or may not want to become a state. Now, the United Kingdom is slightly unusual in that it's 4 nations in one state. But you could also say it's 4 nations within one nation as well, because people normally feel a mixture of subjective emotional tie to Britishness and to, for example, Scottishness in varying proportions. Also, the objective reasons for loyalty are shared, but certainly people in Scotland should feel a sense of gratitude and loyalty to the British state because of what it's provided for them. Now, nationalism is the doctrine that every nation should aspire to be its own state. Now, there are lots of objections to that. The main one, I think, is what's called the Russian doll problem. And the illustration of that closest to home is Ireland, Northern Ireland, Belfast. That's if you take part of a state and say, we're going to make this into a separate state for a particular nation, so they're not a minority anymore in a bigger state. What you do is you create a new minority in the new state, because no area, no territory is entirely uniform, the people that live in it. But I think there are 2 potentially valid reasons why a nation within a larger state could seek independence, could seek to secede. The first potentially valid reason is in the case of injustice. If the territory was gained by invasion, if there are systematic human rights abuses, if there are discriminatory tax policies, democratic rights are restricted in a certain territory, if these issues that the existing government seems to be irredeemable, there could be a case made independence could solve the problem. Reason number 2 that's potentially valid. If there's a settled desire of a significant majority of people within an area, and they don't identify with the current state but with another national grouping, then I think that could justify an independence movement. I say settled view. There shouldn't be a short-term response to contemporary issues for such a big decision that's so hard to reverse, so risky, so expensive, so highly emotive for the people who lose out. So yes, I do think the referendum process that we're in the midst of at the moment is inadequate for such a big decision. So they're the 2 valid reasons for an independence campaign. So Scottish nationalists need to claim that these 2 problems exist and then offer independence as a solution to them. But the problems don't exist. Number 1, alleged injustices. We hear comments, we're governed by London. What do you want, the sovereignty of Westminster or the sovereignty of the people of Scotland? For Westminster or London, what you should really hear is the government democratically elected by the whole of the United Kingdom. I think it's a clear case of rhetoric at the expense of fairness to suggest that there's an injustice there. It's an attempt to generate a sense of oppression out of absolutely nothing. We hear the line, we don't get the government we vote for, but no one does. That's democracy. Okay? No one gets the government they vote for every time. They take our oil. They've been taking our oil for decades. if a natural resource is discovered within the borders of a state, it's shared with the entire state. If oil had been discovered off the coast of England, would we have had 30 years of Scottish nationalists saying, no, it's your oil. No, don't spend it in Scotland. You just keep it there. We've got to be fair about this. The poll tax. They inflicted the poll tax on us. The poll tax was introduced across the United Kingdom. There were riots about it in Trafalgar Square. We now hear about the bedroom tax. People have been denied the right to a spare room at taxpayers' expense. Now, you can debate the bedroom tax. You might like it, you might not. But it's hardly a national injustice. Tory cuts you hear about through the decades. Again, nothing unique about Scotland. So Scottish nationalists are left clutching at straws, taking run-of-the-mill political differences and tried to play them as national injustices. The second issue, identity. The fact is that most people in Scotland are happy to be part of the United Kingdom and identify more or less in various proportions as Scottish and British. They're not hankering for change. So the Yes campaign needs to undermine this sense of solidarity and community, creating an us and them mindset instead. We, the people of Scotland, want, need, etc. What that's effectively saying is we no longer regard UK citizens as co-nationals. We no longer wish to share risks and responsibilities with them. We're no longer willing to commit to a relationship of mutual support with them. So the two problems that independence can validly be offered as a solution to don't exist. So nationalists must strive to create these problems so that independence can then be presented as a solution to them. In terms of national identity, if there is a significant group within a state who feel they don't align themselves with a national identity, that they would prefer to be independent, there are two ways forward. One way forward is secession, create a new state. The other way forward is to try and forge a united sense of national identity. The United States is continually having to do that with its a patchwork of nationalities within it. So how do you choose which policy to take, secession or forging a united national identity? You go with the majority. And that's the best solution here, uniting around British identity. Now, just to try and illustrate the point there, I'm going to use some figures. Obviously, trying to put figures on this is very crude, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point I'm making. If at some point in the recent past, support for Scottish independence was, say, 25%, so 25% of people were unhappy to be part of the United Kingdom, they want change. 60% of people were quite happy with the way it was, and the few in between don't know, don't care. But then a nationalist campaign is launched, and they push and push and push to make people more and more unhappy with the current arrangement, and eventually they might get to the stage at the referendum of just getting over the mark, and then 51% people vote yes. Then after the referendum, you've got 51% of people happy with the current situation, and you might have, say, 40% unhappy. So the sum total of dissatisfaction has been increased, but the nationalists have got what they wanted. I don't see any ultimate moral significance in that victory. Now, there are two potentially valid reasons that don't apply. I'm now going to look at two reasons that are not valid, but that are presented for Scottish independence. Number one, we'd get to keep more money. Scotland's richer, we've got greater resources, and we'd keep it for ourselves instead of having to share it. This is a factor in virtually every cessationist campaign around the world. It's not the real reason for campaigning for Scottish independence. The real reason is national identity. If people would be happy to share with the rest of the state if they shared a sense of national identity and solidarity. But in any case, the line, we've got more and we don't want to share it, just sounds to me like common or garden greed. And from a Christian point of view, I don't see it as a valid argument to make. Right, the second argument that I don't think is valid is to do with different political values. We hear that the people of Scotland have different views on a range of issues, and they do, very slightly different, not by a huge amount, but there are slight differences in Scotland. But if you drew a line in any direction, anywhere in the United Kingdom, the views of people on one side of it will be slightly different than the views of people on the other side of it. Now, even if you believe that Scotland is a particular fount of political wisdom, that can benefit the UK in the Union in proportion, 10% of influence helping 60 million people. Or it could have 100% influence over 6 million people. In terms of the net good to the human race, I would suggest that's equal. But again, with this issue, it really comes down to national identity. Now, if this is about creating an equal and fair nation, which I take to mean a little bit more left-wing, then why do Scottish nationalists want Dumfriesshire, Clydesdale and Tweedale to be part of Scotland? They vote Conservative. Why do they want them? Surely they're against the purpose of the nation. Why should the people in those counties voting Conservative, why should they want to be part of a country whose raison d'etre is to prevent their views having too much influence in government? So I think, again, it's a red herring. The real issue at the heart of it is national identity. Right, to conclude, a minority of Scots feel that Scottish independence would fulfil their sense of national identity. But why expend time and energy campaigning to create division, damage a sense of community, and sour national relationships just for the sake of one's subjective sense of national allegiance? What the people of Scotland want is union, and there's no morally significant reason for nationalists to keep trying to persuade them otherwise, before or after the referendum. In campaigning for Scottish independence, I don't see how one is furthering God's mission on earth in any way. As Christians, with the value of national identity kept in perspective by our higher loyalties, we should be especially willing to seek unity and compromise, and be less willing to fight for our own national identity at the expense of other people's. Thank you.
Thank you to Richard and to all the speakers. I'd now like to welcome John Mason to ask a question to the no side.
Okay, thank you. What do I speak into?
Yes,
okay. Right, well, I was interested in something that Murdo said, which was that one of the signs of success of the UK is that a lot of people want to come here. Now, throughout most of my life, people have been leaving Scotland, and our population has been falling. So, on that basis, the fact that Scotland's population compared to England's has gone from about a quarter when we joined to now less than a tenth, is that not an indication that the UK has failed Scotland?
No, I don't think so, John. I think something called the Industrial Revolution had a part to play in that in the 19th century, when you saw this huge expansion in population, particularly in the north of England. Actually, if you look at Scotland's population today is actually increasing. And that's partly because of an increasing birth rate, and it's partly because we've been successful in attracting a lot of immigrants, in Scotland's case, many of them coming from Eastern Europe, from Poland and elsewhere, because our economy's been doing well. If you look at the UK as a whole, Scotland's economy is performing well. We are behind only London and the South East in terms of economic growth, in terms of unemployment. The unemployment figures were out today. Our unemployment is lower than the UK as a whole. Our rates of employment are higher. There's no sense that we've been held back by being part of the UK. In fact, we're actually doing pretty well. And I think it's inevitable that where you've got a big city like London that's not very far away, of course you're going to get Scots wanting to go down to London to pursue their careers. Many of them do that. Many of them come back to Scotland again. I know many people who've done that. And being independent isn't going to change that, because if you go to London right now, you can hardly move without tripping over young Irish people who've gone to London to make a living. The fact that Ireland is now an independent country doesn't stop the pull, the allure of London having an impact on them. So I recognise London's always going to pull our people away. I just don't think putting up a border is going to make any difference.
You still haven't really answered the facts. That the facts are that our proportion has fallen dramatically from a quarter, a fifth in 1707 to less than a tenth now. So, I mean, you can look at individual things like the Industrial Revolution, but if you look at the big picture, right, the full 300 years, something has gone wrong that so many people have wanted to leave Scotland or had to leave Scotland. And I just feel it's part of your own argument that population movement shows where people want to be, and Scotland has been held back by being part of the UK.
Okay, can I add? All right, sorry.
Sorry, all I was going to say, John, was we in that 300-year period, we moved from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Now, of course, we have a much bigger relative landmass than England relative to our population. When you've got an agricultural economy, that supports a certain level of population. When you move to an industrial economy, clearly the jobs and the people go to where the jobs and centres of industry are. And they were predominantly south of the border.
Yeah, I would disagree that they were predominantly south of the border. Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee and Aberdeen there's a huge industrial area between Glasgow and Edinburgh, so I disagree with that. I think that's a false analysis. And I also think that what you've done is you've given us a very good reason for independence when you mention immigration. Because Scotland could do with more people, but immigration policy in Britain is going to be determined because of an overcrowded England. And I think if we had control of our own immigration, I'd want to encourage more people, more Polish people and others to come to Scotland.
Polish people coming in. There's no barrier at all to immigration within the EU. Any member of the EU, any citizen of the EU can come and live in Scotland today. There's no barrier to that. You don't need to change immigration policy to make that happen. It can happen today.
We can encourage policies that do that. I mean, I'm a chaplain at a university, and the current government policy on immigration for students is actually stopping universities from attracting students from overseas. And I think all of that is being done quite so because England is vastly overcrowded in most areas. Scotland isn't. And that's one of the reasons why we should be separate.
Well, there are 600 million people in the EU. All of them could come and live in Scotland tomorrow if they wanted. There's no barrier to them doing that. Nowhere to live, of course, but we'd have to build the houses.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to invite Murdo Fraser to ask a question to the Yes Society, please.
Thanks. I wonder if I could ask David Robertson this question. David, you're the pastor of a free church congregation in Dundee. It's one which is very lively and vibrant, and you've built it up, and I'm sure it's financially self-sustaining. And yet, it's not an independent congregation. You're a member of the Free Church of Scotland. Mm-hmm. Why are you better together in the Free Church?
Well, thank you, Murdo, because you've just allowed me to explain why Scotland should be independent. Because we are the Free Church of Scotland because we're separate from a larger, more corrupt institution.
I won't debate the corruption of the Church of Scotland.
You do remember the disruption of 1843.
I'll leave that for a different issue. I remember there was a big debate. I think you'll correct me if I'm wrong in my facts. A couple of years ago, there was a big debate in the Free Church over whether you would allow instrumental music to be used in worship. And it was quite a lively and heated and controversial debate. And in the end, the decision was that you should allow that. And there were a minority who were very unhappy with that decision. Should that minority have left and set up their own church?
Well, I think one or two actually did, but that's what tends to happen in Scottish Presbyterianism. We tend to do that all the time. But I think if there were fundamental issues at stake, for example, if the church had decided that it would go against the Bible's teaching on human sexuality, or if the church had decided that Jesus Christ wasn't the only way, then absolutely we should be independent. So there are some issues which you don't become independent over. There are other issues which are key. And I think in reference to the United Kingdom of Great Britain, I'm still completely puzzled as to what British values are when you exclude Christianity.
Okay, thank you. That might be an area for questions later. David, would you now like to ask a question, please, to the NECA?
Yeah, I was very intrigued with Richard's final statement that as Christians we should be less willing to fight for our own national identity and better together and so on. So I assume from this that both my opponents would be against UKIP and would be for more integration in the European Union and indeed in a one world government because we'd be better together. We're all human beings, all made in the image of God. Why should Britain be independent and not Scotland?
I explained in my talk that the key thing here is national identity and a feeling of solidarity with a community of people. I feel a feeling of solidarity with the people of Britain. I'm English, I have a particular solidarity with the people of Scotland as well. That's partly an emotional thing, but there's partly an objective foundation to it as well, that I've benefited by being a British citizen, provided education, healthcare, security, law and order. So I'm attached to that community, and I've got reciprocal rights and responsibilities to it. I don't feel I have that same attachment, emotional and objective, to the wider European community. So I think I've got good reasons to draw the line where I do.
But I mean, by that same argument, I mean, you're almost arguing against having the referendum at all, because presumably you would accept that some Scots don't feel at all British and do feel much closer to the Dutch or the Swiss or other groups within Europe.
No, I think nationalist campaigning isn't justified unless the feeling is is already there. If you've got a situation where it's the settled view of a majority of the people that they want to be a separate state, then I think nationalist campaigning is fulfilling a need, and I can see it can be doing a valuable service in making the world a better place by giving the majority of the people what they want. Where you're not in that situation, where the majority are happy, it's a minority that are unhappy, trying to get the minority to have their own way at the expense of others, I don't see how that serves any ultimate good.
But surely the point of the referendum is to find out, because we do not know at the moment what the people of Scotland want.
I would suggest the Scottish nationalists actually already did know, because you see opinion polls. But even taking that, even accepting John's point, surely you must concede then that the fight should be over after a no vote. But is that the case? Would you then give up?
Yes, can I? Well, I'll come in on this because I'm a Christian, and Christians have always been minorities. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to say just because it's a majority of people. The majority of people can be wrong. So I think you should fight for what you believe to be right. No, and let me finish. The other thing is this. I actually do feel a very strong bond with the Germans and the French. I love Martin Luther and John Calvin. I feel a tremendous bond with the Norwegians and the Swedes. And, I personally, if I had to give myself a national identity, believe it or not, I'm actually English. I was born in England. My father is English, and I'll be voting for Scottish independence. But personally, I feel more European than anything else. So on the notion of your argument, we should just all be part of the European Union and give up national identity altogether.
Now, the thing is that national identity is not something you can argue about rationally. It's something that it's emotional. Okay? So when you say the majority doesn't have to be right, it's not a matter of being right or wrong. It's a matter of being the majority. Okay, so if you've got a majority with a certain national identity, then I think for a minority group to try and overwhelm that in order to get their way, it's just not on a matter of principle. It's not on a moral issue. This is a matter of subjective national identity. And to campaign just to get your way on that, I don't think it serves any ultimate purpose.
So if the majority of people in Europe felt European, you would be willing to give up your UK nationality?
If the majority of people in Europe felt European. No, because I think I've explained already, my primary attachment, I feel solidarity and commitment to the community of Britain. I don't feel that to Europe, so I wouldn't want to go into a community with all of Europe. No.
Thank you very much, and I'd now like to invite Richard to ask a question to the no.
My basic point tonight is that Scottish nationalism, as with all nationalisms, what's really at the heart of it is a sense of national identity. The rest of the argument is decoration, it's justification, trying to win people over to the core issue, which is a subjective sense of national identity. So I'd like to admit, even if I thought Scotland becoming independent would make no difference to anything, it would make no difference to the economy or anything, there's no practical implications to it at all, I would still be opposed to it, because I feel British and associate with the people of Britain. That would be what I want. So I'd like to invite John and David to either agree or disagree. Would they still be for Scottish independence, even if there were no practical considerations, just as a matter of national identity?
Well, I suppose I go back to what I said right at the beginning when I was speaking, that I wanted to make my own decisions, and that's why I left home in my 20s. And yes, I was not so well off for a few years. I would have been better off staying with my parents and eating the food they gave me and all the rest of it. But I, as an individual, wanted to stand on my own 2 feet and make my own decisions. And similarly, that's what I want to see for Scotland.
Okay. And I could say categorically no. If I was in the 19th century, I'd probably be completely for a united kingdom. But I think the compact that we made in the Union of the Crowns and in the Union of the Parliaments has been broken. And the reason I want independence has nothing to do with nationality. I couldn't care what nationality people are. For me, I want independence because I want a more just society, and I think we will get that in a smaller, independent country where we get more say. And that's my sole reason for wanting independence. I might have, post-Second World War, I might not have been for independence. And to be honest, I was 80-90% for independence when this debate started, when the whole referendum thing, and I could have been persuaded the other way, but I haven't. In fact, I've been pushed more. My son's pushed me a wee bit as well, but I've been pushed more towards independence, and it's got nothing to do with nationality, nothing at all. I'm half English. Who knows? I'm probably part Norwegian, Viking, and who cares? That's not the issue. The issue is how we are governed.
Could I come back on that? If that really is the reason, then surely Scottish independence must be second best for David. What really would be the ultimate would be to create Labour and SNP land, where you drew a boundary around left-wing voting areas. And would that be the ultimate? Is Scottish nationalism the second best?
It's called Dundee, by the way.
Yes, unfortunately, we're surrounded by Perth. She still has got some Tories, but no, Richard should know this. I mean, as a theologian, the ultimate for me is heaven, and that isn't Dundee. But the ultimate for me is heaven. If you want, in an ultimately wonderful world, we'd have one world government, we'd have no nationalities, we'd have no wars, imagine John Lennon, all that kind of stuff. But that's not how the world is. So we have to live with practicalities. And the practicality for me is this. Britain is corrupt, it's getting more corrupt, it's being dominated by rich elites, big corporations, big business, and the City of London. And I don't think that is going to be reformed. And I think Scotland would be better off being independent, and we'd have an opportunity. I'm not saying we'd get it, but we'd have a better opportunity to have a more just society.
Just on that point from David, and I often hear this from Yes Scotland campaigners. I did a debate last Friday with Dennis Canavan, who's the chair of Yes Scotland, precisely that pitch about more equal society and get rid of big business and the City of London. Have you read the Scottish Government's white paper, David? Because the Scottish Government's white paper tells you what they want to do. They want to cut corporation tax for large corporations. There are no policies there about redistributing wealth from rich to poor. There's a lot they could do at the moment under the powers of devolution. Even the coalition government down south has focused on early intervention. It's brought in targeted nursery support for vulnerable 2-year-olds. It's brought in a pupil premium for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds so they get more financial support to help fund school places. None of these things have happened in Scotland. They could happen today under devolution. So I just don't buy this. By voting for a constitutional change, suddenly, miraculously, overnight, the whole political culture is going to change and we become the social democratic Nordic paradise that you're painting.
Murdo, you're such a good politician that you could almost become a Free Church minister. Here's the problem with what you've just said. We're not voting for the Scottish Government and its white paper. We're voting for whether Scotland should be independent.
That's not what they say.
No. And afterwards, we get the right to vote for the new Scottish Conservative Party, which if you are able to develop your own policies, I might even vote for it, which is really a revolutionary thing. But we are not voting for particular policies. We're voting whether we should have the right to determine what the policies are, including, should we have the right to say whether Trident is here? Should we have the right to determine the level of abortion? Should we have the right to do all these things, or does that have to be imposed from a 90% majority? So the argument is not about whether we support the Scottish Government or the SNP, and there's many things about the Scottish Government. When the SNP went in favour, or the Scottish Government went in favour of same-sex marriage, I just thought, my goodness, I can't vote for these people. And then I realised, when I'm voting for independence, I'm not voting for them. I'm voting for Scotland to make its own decisions. I'm not voting for the SNP.
Can I come back? Thank you. What we're going to have, John's going to speak, and then both the speakers here.
Right. I mean, specifically, if I can deal with just 2 points that were made there. Cut corporation tax. The only reason for cutting corporation tax is, as Ireland has done, is to attract more investment and more jobs. You would not. You have to make a judgment at the time, but you only cut corporation tax in order to boost jobs, and therefore more people pay PAYE and VAT, and you actually take more tax overall. And to go back to Richard's point, and where I would slightly disagree with David, actually, I mean, yes, when we get to heaven, it'll all be one people and we won't have nations. But I mean, let's remember where the nation started up. That at the Tower of Babel, the idea was that it was not healthy for all the people in the world to be just one. And God deliberately split people up into nations. Now, I totally accept Richard's point that you can then argue over what the nations should be. But I do believe nations are fundamentally a good thing. And Doug Gay kind of argues about that as well.
I was going to say exactly the same as John about the Tower of Babel to start off. But I'd like to challenge David's description of the United Kingdom as a corrupt regime. The corrupt regime, that makes you think Amnesty International, Somalia. Now, this is a really excessive rhetoric, really. The United Kingdom's not perfect. There'll be corruption here and there. But to describe it as a corrupt nation, I think is gross exaggeration. But the key thing in what David was saying is he kept using the word we. And when he used the word we, he meant the people of Scotland. And again, it's creating the us and them. As soon as you're talking about we, the people of Scotland, we, them, the rest of the argument doesn't matter. You've already stated that this is the people I want to express solidarity with and not them. And the rest of the argument is just decoration on top.
David makes a very persuasive pitch. Let's just vote for independence. We can decide it all for ourselves, and we'll be so different from where we are now. I think if you look at the legislation passed in the Scottish Parliament, look at the policies being pursued in the Scottish Parliament, are we that different from the rest of the UK? There's so many things we could do now. We've already got the power to get into schools with early intervention, to tackle poverty. We could even raise taxes if we want to redistribute wealth. Nobody's doing that. The only party ever to propose increasing tax was the SNP in 1999, proposing a penny for Scotland. It was such a flop as a campaign slogan. Nobody's ever done it since then. So I just don't believe that by voting for constitutional change, suddenly everything else is going to change. Suddenly we're going to change our complete political outlook and pursue all these social justice policies that David wants to see. Because if we were people like that, we'd be doing it now.
Yeah, can I just correct one thing? I'm sure when questions will come on to what Murdo's saying, but what Richard said, I didn't say that Britain was a corrupt regime. I said Britain is becoming increasingly corrupt. And I think there's a fundamental corruptness.
So Scotland is.
Yes, I agree. I agree Scotland is as well. I'm not disputing that. But what I'm saying is there's a fundamental corruptness that's creeping in. And the more we reject Christianity, the more that will happen. And I just think we'll have more chance, maybe not much of a chance, but we'll have more chance of preventing that if, as a small nation, we can be independent and make our own decisions.
Okay, thank you very much. It is now time for the audience to get involved. The questions are going to take the following format. We have 2 microphones here at the front. This event is being taped, it is being recorded, it will go on YouTube for people to view afterwards. So I am going to have to ask, please, that people come to either of the microphones if they wish to ask a question to the panellists. Should please remind you at this point, they should be questions, not speeches. Would like you to keep them fairly brief, and we will take 2 at a time, 1 from each side, so the panellists can then choose which ones they want to accept. I'll invite one side to go first, and then some discussion will ensue between the 2 sides. So if I can now invite anybody that would like to ask a question.
It's possibly a question for both sides, but I'll be interested to know the answer. And maybe it's too specific. Maybe we're talking about the future that has yet to be decided, which is the point that's just been made. But the proposal is, I think, that there will only be one house for legislation within Scotland. I believe that there's a risk that perhaps we're going to have the question is, what's going to be to protect us from short-termism and decisions being made on a popularist basis? Because the House of Lords at the moment, being unelected, protects us to some degree from people who are just seeking to make sure that they appeal to the majority, however the majority might be drifting, which is perhaps the secular direction. So if we were independent, what would protect us from short-term politicians?
Thank you very much. And
the Scottish Parliament has passed the named persons legislation, or bill, which gives the right for a state guardian for every child. And I was at a conference the other day where there was a lot of anger about this because of the licence for state snooping. And the instinct seems to be all wrong that the theory seems to be that the state knows best. Is there not a danger in an independent Scotland that this kind of thinking is going to increase?
Okay, I think I would like to invite the yes side to go first.
I'm happy to comment on both. Do you want me to do that?
Yes, please.
Right, okay. Valid points. The first one, at Westminster, the checks and balances are meant to be the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Clearly, with same-sex marriage, that didn't work. If there was meant to be a protection there. Fundamentally, I have a problem with the House of Lords that it's not elected. Do we want a democracy or do we not want a democracy? So there's a kind of fundamental, I think, question in there. Now, the committee system in the Scottish Parliament is meant to give a balance. It doesn't always work, but I would say sometimes it does work. And I can give you an example. I'm on the Finance Committee, freedom of information. The government wanted to exempt the royal family and not to bring any other bodies under freedom of information. The Finance Committee, which is controlled by the same party as the government, disagreed with that, and the government backed down, and the Finance Committee won the day on these points. So I think the system can be good, but a huge amount, and this is where it comes back to a Christian point, a huge amount in any of these systems depends on individual Christians being salt and light whether it's in the House of Lords or the House of Commons where I've been, or in Holyrood. And it's about integrity and some of these values we talked about earlier. So I don't think it's that no system can be absolutely perfect. But it's if we've got people of integrity and these values, that is what makes the system work. On named persons, clearly there are Christians on both sides of that debate as well. I happen to be enthusiastic about the introduction of the named person. I do not think it's a guardian. I have had a child in the East End of Glasgow whose parents, the child got a plaster on. The parents never took the child back to hospital to get the plaster off. And as a result, the child suffered severely. And somehow, none of the public services, they all left it to each other. The GP left it to social work left it to somebody else. So it's to kind of help these vulnerable children. That is the purpose of the named person. And I am certainly, as a Christian, I'm very enthusiastic about it.
Yeah, just say about the named person. Now, I think the mindset that leads to the named person, I don't approve of that scheme. And I think the mindset that leads to it is stronger in Scotland than in the UK in general. But I don't think that's relevant to my views about Scottish independence or devolution. I think devolution in Scotland is a good thing, and I'm not going to change that just because on one particular policy they're coming out with something that I disagree with. I think if I were to say that, I'd be falling into the trap of independence campaigners of trying to say, look, if you change the system, that would enable me to get my way more in government. But I don't want to change the system because it's working out against me on this particular case. Devolution is right. It's a democratically elected parliament. That's what they've decided to do. I disagree, so I'll write letters to the Scotsman about it and I'll object. But I don't see it as cause for me to try and change the constitutional arrangements at all in Scotland.
Yeah. Two brief points. The complaint about the bigger state. Yep, that's a valid complaint, though I think advocating an even bigger state, Great Britain with a more powerful central government, I think, doesn't help. And the House of Lords, that illustrates exactly the point I was trying to make. Because it used to be that largely people got into the House of Lords, maybe because of landed gentry or sometimes on merit. Now, all you have to do is give £1 million to the Labour Party or another 2 million to the Conservative Party, you'll get into the House of Lords. And I think it's wrong. I mean, I would abolish the House of Lords, personally.
I think that the point about the unicameral parliament is a very good one, actually, because the Scottish Parliament was set up, it was never designed to have a situation where any one party would have a majority, because the party's got the majority in Parliament, also has a majority in all the committees. And, I mean, credit to John Mason's party, to my eternal frustration, won the last election so convincingly, they got an overall majority. But that was democracy, but it was never designed to be like that, and therefore you don't have, I think, the checks and balances that are required. And I think some sort of mechanism where you get a chance at least to pause and think about legislation that's passed before it goes for royal assent and becomes law would, to me, make some sort of sense. Maybe that's some sort of post-legislative scrutiny that needs to be built into the system with some committee. And I mean, I hear what people say about the House of Lords. Look, you know, the House of Lords is an anachronism, but it's an anachronism that actually works pretty well, because it does actually act as a counter and a balance to the House of Commons. And it does, on occasion, send legislation back to the House of Commons and say, no, we think you've got this wrong, as they've done several times over the past few years. And members of the House of Lords tend to be more independently minded. So I wouldn't set up a House of Lairds in Scotland, or whatever it might be, but I do think we need something to act as a check on the unfettered power of those elected, as you say, as populist politicians on a day-to-day agenda.
The General Assembly.
of which church, David?
Thank you very much. I think we've heard from all four speakers, so it's time for 2 new questions, please.
A little bit more on the adding a monitor, a government monitor to children, where there's grandparents involved and parents involved, adding another state monitor. In light of the recent findings of pedophilia in state or in government leaders and celebrity leaders that was not investigated properly for years and years, who will, whether we get powers through devolution or through independence, who will monitor the monitors of the Scottish children in the vote?
Mr. Chairman, a very direct question to the Yes campaign. Obviously, the presentations this evening were with passion, with zeal, and with enthusiasm. I failed to identify the following in relation to their presentations. Where do they see economic growth coming from over the next 10 years to sustain Scotland and to take Scotland forward? I leave that question with them. Thank you.
Yeah, you can. Well, the Who Guards the Guardians thing. I don't know. I'd be very wary for the church saying that on the issue of paedophilia, because there have been people within churches who have had positions of power who have abused. The bottom line is all human beings are sinful, and therefore, by definition, all human institutions are sinful. And I think you do need a system of checks and balances. I think also, in terms of the economic growth, this is the thing that astounds me. Scotland is an incredibly rich country. We have we did have a fantastic education system. We've got great hospitals, we've got great industry, we've got fantastic agriculture, we've got the only real whiskey in the world. We've, we invented Presbyterianism. Come on, we built bridges and roads and everything all over the world. I can't believe, this is what I hate. I hate the cringe factor. We can't do without subsidies from Britain. Of course we can. We've got plenty inventiveness amongst our own people and plenty opportunity economically. We should stand on our own 2 feet. And that's where John's thing about the illustration about the children and the parents. Yeah, I mean, it is the case that there are 35-year-old men, young men, who are still at home with their mum doing the ironing. It's about time we grew up.
Yeah, I mean, just on that last point, I mean, I always like John's analogy about growing up and leaving home. I'll use a different analogy. I'm married in a family. I think being married in a family is a great unit of strength. And sometimes if you're married in a family, decisions are taken that you don't agree with. Every year, the 4 of us in my family have a discussion about where we're going to go on holiday. And I want to go to the Western Isles, and my wife and my 2 children want to go to Mallorca. So we end up going to Mallorca. And I don't say, well, that's it, I'm off. I'm going to walk out of this family because a decision is taken I don't agree with, because I accept that there's a compromise to be made for the strength and security of being part of that bigger unit. Anyway, I digress, Mr. Chairman. Coming back to named persons, we voted against the named person legislation. I actually don't think there's something sinister intended here. I don't think something sinister intended here. But I do think it's part of a worrying direction of travel that's about undermining the role of parents in bringing up their children. And had this legislation been limited, as my colleague Liz Smith tried to do with an amendment, been limited to simply children in vulnerable situations, I would have been entirely happy with that. But to extend it across the board to every child, to me, was going too far. So my children will have a named person looking after them. I'm sorry, that should be me. Or actually, it should be their mother. It shouldn't be somebody supported by the state. Actually, that's not an argument for or against independence, by the way. But it's just a point I want to make. On this point about the economy, look, Scotland's a great country. It's full of great, talented people with great initiatives. If we become independent, will we be economically successful? I'll let you into a secret. Yes, I think we will be. But we're going to find it tougher. Let me just give you an example. There are 116,000 people in Scotland today employed in financial services. Speak to the financial services industry. Speak to Scottish Financial Enterprise who represents them. Speak to Standard Life. Speak to Alliance Trust. They'll all tell you the same thing. If we become independent, we have to have a different regulatory regime from the rest of the UK. They are extremely worried about that prospect because there'll be a cost base. It also means that for a company like Standard Life, which is a base and employees in Edinburgh, but 90% of their customers are not in Scotland, but in the rest of the UK, suddenly they'll be in a different legal jurisdiction to their customer base. What are they going to do? They're going to move their centre of operations to where their customers are. Not 10% of their customers, but 90% of their customers. And already the likes of Alliance Trust have said they're setting up subsidiaries in England just to do that. These are not scare stories coming from me. These are what people in the industry are telling us today. So yes, we could be successful if we're independent, but it's putting unnecessary barriers in the way of growing our economy and creating jobs.
Before I invite John to speak, please, I would like to remind everybody that we would like to keep the debate pretty much solely on independence tonight. John.
Yeah, well, back to, the named person, the state monitors and that side of things. The whole point of this is that families and children who are on the radar as being vulnerable already are already part of the system. But what happens if a family that's not on the radar needs help? And one of the examples is the parents need help for the child. Do they go to the GP? Do they go to the social worker? Do they go to the school? And one of the reasons for this legislation is to make it clear for all the families who are not in the system who they would go to if they needed help. But the point is correct that we do need checks and balances. And I would have to say I do not think the UK is particularly good at that at the moment. Apart from the fact it's not really democratic in that the head of state is not elected and neither is one of the chambers. The controls are not really there. And one of the big flaws is no written constitution. The United States has a written constitution, and if any level of government tries to pass something and that is questioned by a member or a church or an individual, they can go to court and challenge the government. The UK does not have that safeguard. We cannot challenge the UK government when it passes legislation. So I would consider that the UK has a very weak system of checks and balances, and we could greatly improve that by having a written constitution. On the points of economic growth, although Murdo says we could use powers we have, the reality is there are a huge number of powers we don't have. One would be corporation tax. Ireland has, despite all its problems, has been quite successful in attracting businesses and jobs and investment because of the lower corporation tax. So that would be a good thing. Our tourism industry is seriously suffering at the moment because of the high rate of air passenger duty. We have no control over that at the moment. Now, maybe Heathrow's busy and they want to put off people coming here. But Scotland is not full, we are not busy, we want to boost tourism, and one of the ways of doing that would be to play around with air passenger duty. Not a huge tax, but it would be really, really useful for us to control it. Allowing students, when foreign students come here, then they can stay on for a couple of years to do some work. We're losing students at the moment to Canada because they are more welcoming, and so they're not coming here, they're not bringing their fees, they're not bringing their skills. Control over mergers and takeovers. At the moment, we had Scottish Power, which was a perfectly good company. My father worked for it all his life, and then they're taken over by a Spanish company. We have no influence over that at the moment whatsoever. The railways, the German railways and other railways are controlled by the state. They come in here and they run our railways. There is something very far wrong with the economy. And Murdo talks about a different regulatory system. Well, look how the present regulatory system worked. Not very well with the banks. Maybe we could do with a better regulatory system.
John's analogy about standing on his own 2 feet leading home, Murdo dealt with that, but I'd just like to add, arguing from an analogy is a formal logical fallacy. It's not a valid form of argument. And I think the way that John presented it, it did sound as if he was arguing from analogy. Now, David mentioned that the cringe. Now, that brings up an interesting thing, because nationalists worldwide, they often find it difficult to understand why some people within their nation fail to be awoken to nationalistic fervour alongside them. And then often explain it in terms of psychological problems that some people must have. They lack confidence, they're cowardly, they lack vision, they lack self-esteem. Anything apart from realising that just some people are happy with the situation they're in at the moment. I think we hear that in Scotland, as with every other nationalist campaign. Now, I think the story about Westminster Parliament needing more checks and balances, you'd find people who believe that all through the United Kingdom say we'll campaign to make that change. Every issue that comes up, it shouldn't be addressed as how can we change the constitution to sort this out. We're a democracy. The way you sort out things is by campaigning and having your say and influencing the system. Just to finish very, very quickly, John mentioned the reduction in air passenger duty. I found that quite ironic in the Scotland's Future document, because it talks about how we're going to be environmentally friendly, sustainability, this is really central to our moral duty as a nation. Then it's saying, we'll make your summer holidays cheaper by making flights cheaper. So you'll be able to go on a holiday more, polluting the environment, it'll save you a few more pounds in your pocket. And I think it wasn't really joined up thinking, shall we say.
Okay, I think it's time for 2 more questions, please.
To reassure Murdo Fraser, I'm
Sorry,
one
is
of
this
the...
going to be a question?
Yeah, it's a question. One of the so-called militant secularists that he's so worried about. But just to reassure him, I'm undecided, so it's all to play for, Murdo. So my question is, I'd like to ask each of the panellists if they support decentralisation of education so that faith and belief groups can run schools across Scotland, and do they think that education would be more or less likely to make that happen?
Yeah, my question's for the no side. You've described the UK as a success. but you've not really given a proper definition, I mean, that defines us apart from every other country in the world. The NHS and the economy have been mentioned, but if you look what's happening to the NHS down south, which could well happen up here, and also, well, the economy doesn't really need talked about because look what happened a few years ago. So how would you define the UK as a success?
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to invite Richard.
Okay, the question about education, again, that's not a question I would look at through the lens of how do I get what I want by having the constitution the way that suits me, so that my views get put into practice. I would come in Scotland and a UK level. I think diverse schools are good. You need checks and balances. But again, I don't think it's a relevant issue to talk about changing the constitution about. Now, in terms of what makes the UK a successful country, I think on any measure, okay, the UK is not perfect. You talk about the NHS falling apart in England. Again, this is a gross exaggeration. Okay, of course, healthcare costs are soaring. Of course, it's not perfect. But it's still a fantastic system. There's law and order. There's democracy. There's a huge amount that we're blessed with in this country. And I think, obviously, as a Scottish nationalist, you've got to make the UK, you've got to paint it in the blackest possible light. So it really does sound like something you just want to get out of. It is such an awful country, you want to get out of it. And I think it's gross exaggerations. And I also think, coming back to what I said early on, everyone in Scotland should feel a sense of gratitude and duty of loyalty towards the UK state because of what it's provided for them in terms of law and order, education, healthcare, etc., etc., etc. And I think that's an objective responsibility. And I'd ask independence campaigners to bear that in mind when they're planning their rhetoric about their description of the United Kingdom.
Well, I mean, I don't want to be super spiritual here, but I am. No. I'm thankful to God for every gift that we receive from common grace. And I'm reluctant to attribute that to particular nationalities. And you ask what made the United Kingdom successful. I think it was our Christianity. And I think we got rid of slavery because of Christianity at an enormous cost in the 19th century. And even the NHS and the welfare state, which I'm tremendously proud of, came from the Beveridge Report. And Beveridge Report presupposed a Christian ethos and a Christian country. And the reason the welfare state will collapse and the NHS will collapse is because that root is going to be taken away. So what made the UK successful was its Christianity. And again, I see no reason to remain in a United Kingdom which is not based upon that. As regards education, I agree with Richard that actually the Scottish Parliament already has control of education. I think education is an enormously important thing. But I do think that independence will help us in terms of education, not least I think, because of the universities. So, again, I don't see a downside to being independent in any of this respect.
Thank you. We'll go to Murdo.
Yeah, I agree on the education issue. Education has already devolved. In fact, even before the Scottish Parliament was set up, education in Scotland was always separate from education elsewhere in the UK. So I don't really see independence, yes or no, make any difference. On the point of the UK being a success, I think if you go in many places in the world, the UK is still a beacon of freedom, democracy and human rights. And I accept the UK is not perfect. And I expect we've got challenges. But, you know, compared to many other places in the world, we do extremely well. And there are people all over the world who would give anything to have the opportunity to come and live here in our country rather than where they currently are. I don't think we should talk down the country we live in and what we've achieved and built together.
Yes, I mean, on education, I certainly believe in pushing decisions down as far as we can, and that even in Glasgow would be below Glasgow City Council, which I think is a very centralist organisation. But I mean, our party policy would be choice for parents, and if there's enough parents wanting a particular kind of school, then that could be publicly funded. I mean, we've discussed it certainly in the Baptist Union amongst Christians, and there's a variety of views. I mean, some Christians would like to see more evangelical or whatever Christian schools set up. Others are very keen that as a family they're involved as salt and light in the local school and being a witness there. So there's clearly different views even amongst Christians. Has the UK been a success? Well, I'm happy to say the UK has not been awful, but I'm very uncomfortable with a kind of wall around the UK that somehow the UK is superior to everybody else. I mean, when I was in Nepal for 3 years, the people I was most friendly with, felt most relaxed with, shared a sense of humour with, shared a fair bit of the kind of mix of Reformed and Catholic background in the country was the Dutch. They were the people I would have to say I could identify with, another small country. And I mean, to say that the UK, we should be grateful for what the UK has provided for us, I mean, that is a very, it sounds like we're subjects rather than citizens. And I mean, let's just remember, if it wasn't that the Scottish Parliament, across the parties, was opposing student fees, the UK would have made us pay £9,000 a time to be a student at a university. So I don't think the UK has provided us all that much in that regard.
Time for 2 more questions, please.
One of the issues that was raised earlier was that of the immigration issues, and there is obviously both sides kind of pointed about things to do with EU immigration and Polish people and others who are coming to Scotland and would still be able to come to Scotland one way or the other. I would maybe like to refocus the immigration question on another aspect of this, and that is the non-EU immigration, specifically bringing in something that Murdo referenced, which was the importance of marriage within the system and recognising marriage as a Christian value and how we approach that. And one of the issues that has recently come across from the coalition government's changing policies in immigration is the financial requirement for spouse visas, which does have the effect of often forcing families to either split up or be out of the country. And I have personal experience of friends who met at university, were students, got married, one Scottish, one Canadian, in fact, and Canada was much more welcoming to them, and the financial requirements, especially for a young couple got married, they couldn't stay in Scotland. And how would that be dealt with? Thanks.
David, my question is for you, although I did agree with a lot more of what you said. Richard, whichever way I do vote, it won't be because of national identity, and I do think you sort of shot yourself in the foot arguing against Scottish nationalism, arguing because of your British nationalism. But David, my question was, you said several times that Britain is increasingly corrupt, as is Scotland, and I just wondered what exactly do you mean by that? Do you mean financially corrupt or spiritually? And if so, is that, I should say right now, I am another of those militant secularists, is that more moderate Christians who are perhaps willing to vote for same-sex marriage, atheists, secularists, Muslims? What exactly is it you mean by that? Thank you.
Okay. Can I recommend that you read Vishnu Mangalwadi's book, The Book That Made Your World? Because he shows in that book the difference between India and the Netherlands, largely being because of Christian values. My own belief is that as we are rejecting Christianity, we are becoming more corrupt. Slavery was not abolished in the 19th century. There are 20,000 people in Britain today who are slaves. It's returned. I think the sexual corruption, the twistedness, I think the financial corruption, I think how many people trust politicians? The last time I was here, Willie Rennie made a statement that he thought, I just was so naive, leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, he said, politicians listen to the people and then do what they say. And everyone burst out laughing. Because we don't. And I think there is a cynicism, there's something that's wrong there. And we're not as corrupt as we could be, and there's a great heritage that remains, and there's a lot of really, really good things. I don't want to be saying that, but I'm saying when the root is rejected, the fruit will remain for a while. But because there is no life, there's no sap coming into it, ultimately that fruit will become corrupt. British people do not have British values because they are inherently superior. The values that made Britain great were Christian values. And who knows, but I suspect in the 21st century you'll find that the Chinese are much more likely to have that. The point on the immigration is a really, really important one. I think it is disgusting, and I've had to deal with this, that a couple can get married who have met here, who are in love, one of whom is Scottish, and they're told that their partner cannot come to live in Scotland because he's working for a charity and doesn't earn £18,000 a year. I think that's profoundly disgusting. And I think it's also disgusting that if you've got £250,000, you can buy your way in here. I think it is ridiculous that in the midst of a housing crisis that we cater to Greek oligarchs who are pulling money out of their own country and buying £10 million houses in London. So that's why I want control of our own immigration, so that we can be more generous and welcome the poor and not have a standard which says if you're wealthy you can get in, if you're poor, forget it.
Okay. Can I address that point directly, because I've dealt with a number of constituency cases precisely on the grounds that you mentioned about the financial restriction. And I think we have to understand very simply why this was brought in. And it was brought in by the government because there were organised crime marriage scams taking place, where very often poor women living here, some of them from ethnic minorities, were being married off to people from other countries in order to get them British visas. And the government had to deal with that problem because it was a huge problem on a large scale and run by organised crime, and it brought the requirement in. And I completely sympathise, and I understand it's a blunt instrument, and I personally would like to see that looked at again, to see if there's some other measure could be brought in. But I understand why something had to be done. And it goes back to the point raised earlier about universities. Again, the reason why the government had to clamp down on university visas was because there were bogus colleges being set up all over the country, which didn't exist, had no teaching, had no courses, had no staff, had a brass plate outside the building, and were being used as a scam funded by organised crime to get visas to people from countries to come into the UK, to get entry to the country, and would then disappear when they came in. And that's why it was brought in. So yes, I would be delighted to see changes to the immigration system to make a fairer system. But even if we became independent, we would face the same challenges. We would still have to deal with some of these scams and the impact of organised crime in a fallen society.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I also have friends, she's Scottish, later in life she married an American, they're now at retirement age, they can't afford to live in America because of the health costs, and the UK is refusing to allow them to live here. And they are really struggling, and they rely on friends giving them money and all this kind of thing. So I think the point I was making about population, I mean, we do not have a population problem here. We really want a bit more. And if it's retired people who can have their own means, absolutely, let's welcome them here. So I think we could be more relaxed about the whole immigration thing. And I think, Murdo to some extent answered that for us, that clearly the situation that England or the rest of the UK is facing is very, very different from the situation that Scotland is facing, and we need a different solution to that question. I mean, I think as soon as we get into areas like corruption and things like that, I mean, I'm back to, in this case, the Church of Scotland paper, two of their values, number 6, honesty, number 9, compassion. I think when you're talking at that kind of level, we are talking about internal values that people have. And I put it back to the churches that if people are going to become more honest, primarily politicians aren't going to do that. It's going to be the churches that are going to help do that.
Just going to the immigration issue again, I would see this one that if it's something devolved to Scotland, then campaign about it in Scotland, vote accordingly. If it's UK, campaign about it on a UK-wide basis, vote accordingly. I don't think this. As soon as you start looking at every issue through how can we change the constitution to sort this one out, then it's just not helpful. It's a democracy in Scotland, it's a democracy in the UK. If you want something to change, campaign for it. I'd just like to come back to what David said. David said he doesn't feel grateful to a nation for things that is given to him. It was more a state, I was saying, rather than a nation. I'd just like to have another try at persuading him. See, I'm part of a community of people that have agreed that they'll pay money into a pot, and if I am taken ill, they'll provide healthcare for me. If I lose my job, they'll help me out a bit. They provided education for me when I was very young, etc., etc., etc. So within that community, I feel it's my responsibility to contribute and to feel some sense of loyalty and responsibility to play my part in that community as well. Now, that's not undermining gratitude to God any more than my loyalty to my family for the things they provide for me undermines gratitude to God. But I think a sense of mutual responsibility and loyalty is perfectly justified in that situation for objective reasons, not subjective.
Thank you very much. And it's time for 2 more questions, please.
To David, I think you mentioned in terms of, the future that Scotland could have and equality, morality and things like that. I mean, what evidence is there that independence would provide this kind of utopia of integrity, of equality and morality? Do Scottish people have greater moral fibre? Are we different from other humans? How does this come about? That we suddenly, because at the moment we're spearheading same-sex marriage, euthanasia, other things from here in Scotland ahead of the English. So I'm not entirely sure how this comes to be. Maybe you could explain.
Okay. And from this side, please.
Yes, this is really for the yes, I suppose. I'm thinking of what's coming ahead. We appear to be entering a possible Cold War again, probably led a bit by Mr. Obama and co. But can we go back, if you could go back to Iraq, where so many of our soldiers died, but so many more Iraqis died, and I'm not sure, what the situation would have been had we been independent, because we got nowhere with any complaints. Westminster didn't listen, as far as I can see. Please, thank you.
Okay. I'll go first, because the first question was, I'll come to your question in a minute, but it was identified to me. I can simply answer that question by saying I'm a Scottish Calvinist, which means under no circumstances can be accused of being optimistic and believing in utopia. If there's sunshine today, there's going to be rain for the rest of the week, and we'll pay for it. I was not arguing for utopia. I don't think we live in utopia. I think the argument on both sides, anyone who argues, vote for Scotland independence and we'll be in the land of candy and milk and honey. No. Just as saying, vote for the Union and we'll remain in this land of candy, milk and honey. No. But my simple reason, I expect Scotland to continue to go downhill, as I expect the United Kingdom to continue to go downhill unless there's a renewal and revival. But I do think that smaller nations are more likely. For me personally, I know that I will have more say in an independent Scotland than I will in the European Union, or than I will certainly from a London-governed United Kingdom. Also, it's not correct to say that we are ahead of the English in terms of, or the British Parliament in terms of same-sex marriage and so on. That wasn't the case. I actually think the process here was done much better. I disagreed with it completely, the result, but I think it was done much better than was done in England. And I thought the level of debate was actually, compared with the Westminster Parliament, was actually considerably better, though still pretty appalling. The Iraq thing, or the nations and the Cold War and so on, my frustration was simply this. If I'd been in the army, I would have ended up being disciplined because I would have refused to go and fight in Iraq. I thought it was wrong from the beginning. I thought it was wrong the first time. I thought it was wrong the second time. I thought it was based on a utopian view, which is again why I went out. Because when George Bush and Tony Blair thought, if we just give the Iraqis democracy, then they'll want to be like us. That's part of an imperialistic Western arrogance, which has done so much harm. And tonight, 500,000 people have fled Mosul because we didn't take account of what was going to happen, including in that, the only 1,000 Christian families that are left, they're all gone. The number of Christians in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was there, horror though he was over 500,000. It's now down below 100,000. And after this week's events, it's going to get even worse. So for me, at least an independent Scotland would be able to say, we're not having Trident and we're not getting involved in illegal wars. And I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, just on that last point about the Cold War, it's very interesting. There was, as people might remember, a big debate in the House of Commons last year about whether we should intervene in Syria. And if you cast your mind back to then, Barack Obama was gung-ho for Syrian military intervention. And had the UK Parliament, and David Cameron was pretty gung-ho too, and had it been left to the executive to decide this, there would have been military intervention in Syria. Personally, I think that would have been a big mistake. But David Cameron decided quite rightly that he would not go down that route without parliamentary approval. And he went to Parliament, and he went to the House of Commons, and they had a very good debate. And they voted rather narrowly, and they voted narrowly to oppose intervention in Syria. And that meant because the British were not going to intervene, the Americans decided not to as well. And to me, that was the right outcome. But it only happened because of the Parliament. And it only happened because of the Scots MPs in the Parliament. and the influence that the 59 members of the Scottish, from Scottish constituencies had they not been there, England, Wales and Northern Ireland would have had a majority to go into war in Syria, and Barack Obama would have got the support he needed to intervene in Syria, and there would have been military intervention in Syria. And the simple point I'm making is this: Scotland's influence in the world for good is greater by being part of the UK than it would be if we were an independent country.
I basically agree with everything David said about the whole thing with same-sex marriage, that actually it was pushed through faster in the UK. So obviously I disagreed with what happened here, but I agree with his points that there were some good things about how it was handled. I certainly, I'd want to make it clear that, I don't think we are more moral than any other place. So, I don't like the word utopia. I don't like anything suggesting that we are better in any way than anybody else. What I would say, though, just to look at some of the practicalities, is that if you take the two biggest parties in the Parliament, Labour and the SNP, there was a real abhorrence of the bedroom tax. That people who were on the benefit level, which is presumably the minimum you need to live on, were going to have to pay some of that money because for whatever reason they had an extra bedroom, and therefore presumably they were not going to have enough to live on. And that's what the bedroom tax was about. And we did not have power over that, but to be fair to the Labour Party, really pushed, and with the SNP as well, we found the 50 million, which could have gone to health and could have gone to education, could have gone elsewhere, but we felt it was just so wrong, the bedroom tax, that we were going to deal with that. And that may be, for some people, that's a little thing, but I think it just shows a sense of direction, of the kind of direction we could go in Scotland, we probably would go in Scotland, but it's certainly not all perfect. On the kind of defence and that side of things, really there's a whole lot of issues here, but one I would just make is that, the UK is trying to portray itself as a world power, which I would argue it no longer is. That's why the money is going into nuclear weapons and into aircraft carriers, which they do not need for normal defence, and as a result, the conventional defences have suffered. And we have no Nimrod aircraft, we have no surveillance aircraft now to check on the seas as we used to have. Generally speaking, the conventional side has suffered because of this portrayal of we are a superpower.
I think David and John are trying to have their cake and eat it on this point.
Absolutely, that's what you do with cake.
They're trying to say... they're trying to say... They're saying, no, we would never suggest the Scottish people have got superior values, more moral values. But the reason we should have an independent Scotland is then the people of Scotland would choose to make a much more moral place, because that's what they're like. You can't have it both ways. Now, if you look at, I think Murdo's answer to the question about, we were talking about Syria, was absolutely brilliant, because it shows that you can have proportionate influence in a bigger country, or you can have greater influence in a smaller country, which in turn has smaller influence on the world stage. It's a zero-sum game. One person has one vote's worth of influence, whether that's within Scotland or within the United Kingdom. Now, David made the obviously true statement that the smaller a country, the more say you've got. Okay, so why not cut Scotland in half, have even more say? That argument, it's so obvious, but it doesn't justify dividing every possible democratic population into smaller sections. David again referred to London rule. I had an idea at the beginning of the referendum campaign. I thought the Westminster Parliament should have relocated to Glasgow. So nationalists wouldn't be able to say, I'm fed up of being dictated to by London, run by London. They'd have had to say, dictated to by Glasgow, run from Glasgow. Wouldn't have had quite the same ring to it. The fact that the UK Parliament happens to be located in London is entirely trivial. It's a purely rhetorical point, trying to generate a sense of oppression and injustice out of absolutely nothing. Again, the bedroom tax, I would say again, that's a common or garden political issue. Okay, campaign on it, vote for who you like, but every single issue shouldn't be addressed from the point of view, how can we change the Constitution to address this single common or garden political issue?
Okay, thank you. We are now running a little short of time, determined to finish at 9:30. So what I'm going to do is ask each of the final questioners, please, to ask their question, and then the speakers can choose to incorporate it into their final 2-minute speech or not responses. I believe the panel, some of the panel are going to be staying behind afterwards as well. So if you feel your question hasn't been properly answered, you may try and approach them afterwards. If I could ask you to make your questions in that fashion, please.
My question is around the immediate aftermath of a potential yes vote. Many of us will understand from our working lives the huge cost and disruption of large-scale change. You try and divest a bank and watch the chaos. A yes vote is to embark upon the construction of a new state, the dismembering from the United Kingdom and creating a new state and all the apparatus that goes along with that. Do you not accept that to ask the people of Scotland to vote yes is to ask them to embark upon an unknown, uncosted period of disruption? And do you not agree that to do so at a time when the economy is only just getting back on its feet is unjustifiable?
My question is mainly for David, but it's open to everyone. You were saying that the UK's success came from its Christian views, and that you wanted out of the UK because you think that these views are now declining. Now, numbers are just numbers, but according to the 2011 census, Scotland, as a proportion of the population, had the lowest amount of Christians compared to England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Seeing this as a Christian debate, do you think it would be wise to split from the UK? That would result in a lower proportion of Christians in the population. And if so, how would you expect these Christian views to be encouraged and to increase in a way that they can't within the UK?
My question is for David. David, you were saying at one point that you think we would have a better, though not necessarily guaranteed, opportunity to have more of a say in voting on our government and our policies. What makes you think that we should go ahead with becoming independent, not necessarily knowing the certain result of becoming independent?
Again, David, in your opening speech, I think it was, you mentioned a hope that Scotland could become a spiritual leader. And so a question for everyone would be, given independence or staying with the United Kingdom, could it be possible for us to become more of a spiritual leader in the future?
Thank you, and thank you to all those who've contributed from the floor. It's really added to the debate. Each speaker will now make a 2-minute summary speech, although we might have to give David 2.5 minutes based on those last few questions. And it'll be in reverse order, so if I could invite Richard to come up first, please.
Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to go to the left?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I'd like to finish by reiterating that I feel British. That's an important part of my identity and proud of a lot of aspects of British history. I associate myself with those traditions. I also regard myself as English, obviously, most of my life in English. I love living in Scotland. It's a great place to be. I came here to work. I had no hesitation of moving to a different part of the United Kingdom. I love going to Wales and Northern Ireland. I love the variety, the diversity, meeting the different people, seeing the different customs, but I don't regard them as foreign countries at all. I really appreciate the unity and diversity that we have in the United Kingdom. My main point tonight has been that the Scottish independence campaign is ultimately about national identity, trying to create us and them instead of a community and cooperation together. And I think this sense of national identity is ultimately subjective, and it's of no ultimate moral significance. So what we need to aim for is a compromise for a united position for a harmonious nation. Now, I think hopefully Scottish independence campaigners by October will be able to accept that what people want in Scotland is to be part of the United Kingdom. And I hope that they then say, we're not going to persevere, keep trying to fracture the existing community. I would encourage Scottish nationalists to become cultural nationalists, to value Scottish culture, to promote Scottish culture. If they want to focus on Scotland politically, focus on it through devolution and increased devolution that's to come. And that option's there. Devolution offers a great compromise here, where people can say, I'm not quite getting exactly what I want, but we can unite about it, we can not have an ongoing battle on this, and we can have some harmony in the nation. So I really hope that Scotland in the future can arrive at a stable compromise instead of having decades to come of backwards and forwards independence campaigning, trying to stir up dissatisfaction and division in our society. And I think from a Christian point of view, I think that's a worthwhile end. Thank you.
Okay, don't start your clock just yet. I've got mine. The point about being unknown and uncosted. Come on, do you really think the future of Britain is known and costed? I don't think it is, not at all. I think only God knows what it's going to be like, and I certainly don't trust our government and its economics at all. So the same applies both ways. The question about the Christians and was it wise to split and the quantity and so on, it depends, of course, I think, what you mean by Christian, and I think quality, not quantity, counts. Murdo said successful countries don't break up. So all you Australians and Americans and Canadians who used to be part of Britain, welcome back. The injustice point, Richard has a phenomenal faith in democracy. I don't. I don't think democracy works without Christianity. And I don't think it works without maths either. 10% and 90%, that doesn't work. I am absolutely certain Murdo's marriage is not his wife 10%, or actually him 10% and his wife 90%. It's meant to be a partnership. That's the problem with the union. It's no longer a partnership. Richard, it's not about national identity. I don't care. I mean, and this vote is not about national identity. You can be Pakistani and living in Scotland and you get a vote. My daughter is Scottish. She was born here. She lives in Australia. She doesn't get a vote. It's not about national identity. Murdo, I love Murdo. Well, I love Richard as well. But Murdo, I feel for Murdo. I feel that he's like a butterfly that's got his wings clipped and he's squashed in there in the British Tory party. Can you imagine what Murdo would be like if he was free in a Scottish Tory party? Where his policy was not handled by David Cameron. Keep more money and keep it for ourselves so we don't have to share. That is not our position. I want to keep more money so that we can share. I don't want to spend it on Trident, on wars on Iraq, or on housing bubbles in the southeast of England. I want us to share it. And I finish with simply this. Rosanna Cunningham, who is one of my favourite politicians, and I have politicians across all different, she came and spoke to the Free Church General Assembly, and she was fly. She quoted from the Memoirs of the Disruption. And it was wonderful, and it was a quote about Scottish independence, which most people didn't know was there. But she was very clever. A Roman Catholic lady speaking to the Free Church General Assembly, and she could have been elected moderator after that. But, and this is where I think, look, yes, please vote on September, whenever it is. I don't even know when it is. Please vote in September. But what's much more important is please pray for Scotland and do what the Bible says. Pray for kings and those in authority first of all, even if you don't agree with them. Pray regularly for David Cameron, Alex Salmond, the Queen. Murdo Fraser, he needs your prayers. Thank you.
Yeah, I do. Please pray for all of us. I suppose the first question is, what problem is solved by voting for a different constitution? A lot of things we've heard tonight, and we discussed tonight about education, we can do already. We can do lots already. I think we've got the best of both worlds. We've got a Scottish Parliament. We can decide lots of things for ourselves. We can have a big discussion about whether there should be more devolution, what additional powers might be devolved to Scotland. Some things we do here. Other things are better shared with the people with whom we have most in common, the people of England, Wales and Northern Ireland, with whom we have 300 years of shared history. What would be the cost of establishing a new state? Well, we don't know, because the SNP and the Yes campaign haven't told us, just as they haven't told us a whole lot of other things, like if there's not going to be a currency union and we're not allowed to use the pound, what's our currency going to be? And it's all sorts of other things that they haven't told us. And what it comes down to is this, I think this question is a leap of faith. If you believe in your heart, if you've got that nationalist view that Scotland should be an independent country, we should do it ourselves, then vote yes. Vote yes, if you really believe that. But I don't think that's a majority view in Scotland. I don't think it's ever been a majority view in Scotland. I can't think of a single opinion poll in the last 2 decades that showed the majority of people thinking like that. To me, this comes down to a simple question of identity. I don't think there's a persuasive, compelling, rational argument saying we must vote yes. It's about how you feel. And I feel, like I think most people in Scotland feel, that I have 2 identities. I'm proud to be Scottish, and I'm proud to be British. I'm proud of both of those parts of my identity. I don't see why I have to choose between them. Why somebody's got the right to take part of my identity away from me. David Robertson or anyone else. But let's just end on a point on agreement. David Robertson says we should vote for independence because we'd become a more spiritual nation. I so wish that was true. I so wish that was true. I just don't see voting for a different type of government is going to make that bit of difference. So I'll be voting no in September, and I hope you will too, but actually much more important than that. Let's hope we can have, and let's pray we can have a nation where the name of Jesus Christ is glorified, because that's a far more important objective, and one I hope we can all unite around.
Firstly, to answer the first 2 questions that were asked there, the cost of setting up an independent Scotland. I mean, many of the offices and things like the DWP, we already have the staff here, so it would just be a question of slightly rearranging people's responsibilities. But a figure of 250 million has been put on it. But going back to my analogy of moving home, you do what you can afford to do. And clearly the cost of creating a new, simpler income tax system, a new, simpler corporation tax system will take a bit of time and will take a bit of money, but we do that as we can afford it. And I mean, I bought a lot of second-hand stuff when I moved home in 1990 into my present flat, and I paid £60 for my fridge thinking that I would replace it in due course, and I'll have you know that that £60 fridge is still working. So we do it as we can afford it. Let's not just think the risks are if Scotland goes independent. There are huge risks if the UK, we stay in the UK. The debt is something like £1.5 trillion. Traditionally, a lot of countries, when they're heavily in debt, they allow inflation to take off in order to get the debt to go down. There is a serious risk that the UK in the next 10, 20 years is going to have so much problem with the debt that they will just let inflation rip. So life in the UK could be pretty grim, I can assure you. I have to say, on the point of the number of Christians, I mean, I think it can't be that different in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and really I don't think that's an issue for independence. I think either way, I'm positive about the future. I think that the more the church is distinct from the state, that is very good. In that sense, we're a bit ahead of England because they've still got this problem with the Church of England being linked up with the state. But either way, we're going to have to think about, as Christians, we're going to have to think about society in a different way. We're going to be salt and light. But the church in Acts was persecuted and did really well. It really grew. The church in China was persecuted and did really well. It really grew. So we don't need to be afraid of the future. And just to sum up then, I mean, the suggestion has been that maybe a majority don't want independence. I would put it slightly differently. I think when I meet people, the majority do want independence, but some of them are maybe going to vote no because they're a bit nervous. So if there is a no vote in September, my understanding will be that if the budget gets cut or whatever over the following years, people will realise that they made a mistake. And so I will certainly be campaigning after about a week off on holiday. Final point, the UK is too small. In the past, the UK was a big world power. It is no longer a big world power. We cannot draw a line around the UK and just carry on as has been done for the last 300 years. We have got to work more closely with our European friends. Lots of us have friends from across Europe. Economically, we're competing with the States, with China, with India, with Russia, much bigger places. The UK is too small for that. We need to work much more closely with our friends across Europe. And just an example, a small country is different from a big country. But one of the most successful opportunities to bring peace in the Middle East was in Norway. Why was it in Norway? Because Norway is a small country. People were not threatened by Norway. They could feel safe in Norway. So a small country has a role that a big country cannot have.
Okay, and I think one final round of applause, please, for all of our speakers tonight.
Tonight's debate comes out and has been organised by SOLAS and really the vision of SOLAS. And I'd like to just briefly, to conclude tonight, share a little bit about what SOLAS is about. SOLAS comes from the Gaelic word for light, and it is about bringing the gospel and the light of the gospel into all areas of life. And that includes the political realm, and that's why events like this are organised. SOLAS is doing a whole variety of things, and we do have a stall downstairs. We have papers we've produced on Christianity. Is Christianity credible in a suffering world? On euthanasia and assisted suicide. We've also got some books we've produced. We've produced a manual, essentially, for running cafe-style evangelist courses in your churches or in other things called Quench. We've produced a book called Why I'm Not an Atheist, which is basically a bunch of people from different backgrounds answering that question. And we also have 2 copies downstairs of David Robertson's new book called Magnificent Obsession, which is his reflections on Jesus and why Christopher Hitchens can say that God is not great, but David says that Jesus is. And so those are downstairs, and do come and talk to us. SOLAS also runs a conference in November, and connected to that, or kind of just before that, we're also running SOLAS Connect training, which is on church-based persuasive evangelism. And it's a training course on how to use evangelism, engaging with culture through different things that we can do. And various people are teaching that in Dundee. So we do have leaflets. If you're involved in a church, leaders, and are interested in this, come see it downstairs, talk to us. David knows a lot about that as well. And the Edinburgh group is running more events in Edinburgh. We have thoughts about running events maybe on Islam and Christianity and other debates and other events. So if you or your church are interested in getting involved in a debate, have an idea for a debate, talk to us downstairs. We have a mailing list if you want to hear about what we're running in Edinburgh specifically, and please do just come and talk to us and get involved in SOLAS, because it is for all Christians to work in this field. Finally, I would like to kind of come to tonight's debate. There are some leaflets that have been left downstairs, both by Murdo and John, and so please do come and talk to them. All of the speakers will be downstairs for a while if you want to ask them any further questions. We've also got leaflets for a tour that the Evangelical Alliance are doing on the back of the What Kind of Nation, and there's still nights going on in Glasgow, Aberdeen, Stirling, Dundee, Inverness, so there are some leaflets downstairs on that. To end tonight, I would like to thank everyone for coming along tonight, for taking part. You all have contributed and added a lot to this debate, and I hope you have enjoyed this evening and learned a lot from it. Thanks particularly to Will Clayton for chairing tonight's debate. I think he has done an excellent job. And people don't often realise how important a good chair is to actually keep matters in order and sort out some of these guys, so it is great to have him. Thanks especially as well to John Mason and Murdo Fraser for agreeing to come along tonight to express their views publicly and to speak to so many of you, and also to Richard and David. SOLAS doesn't really thank them, but I think all you want to thank them for being here tonight, so thank you very much to all our speakers. And the final thank you, well, almost the final thank you I want to give tonight is to Charlotte Chapel for hosting us tonight. They have made this really fantastic event. They've done so much of the work and taken the burden really off us in many ways. So many of them are helping with stewarding and tea and coffee downstairs afterwards. So it is great that we are able to be here tonight. And so I would like to thank them. Clap them as well. But finally, this, as I kind of said at the start, this is a bit different from the events that SOLAS normally organises. We don't normally have debates with exclusively Christian panels. We don't normally advertise events as kind of the Christian perspectives on something. But this issue, we really wanted to engage with that. And so unlike most of the events we run in Edinburgh, I would like to conclude tonight by actually inviting Paul Rees, the senior pastor at Charlotte Chapel, to come up and actually do what so many of the panel have said and pray for us and thank God for tonight's event, but also pray for our nation. I'd like Paul to conclude.
Let's pray. Our gracious Father, we thank you for the privileges that we enjoy in this nation of freedom of speech, to gather freely this evening from different backgrounds to discuss these important matters. We do want to thank you for all our contributors. Thank you for the tone in which it's been engaged with. Lord, that we feel these things passionately, but we thank you that we can discuss these things civilly. We now turn to you, acknowledging that you are sovereign over all the world and over all the affairs of men. And we come to ask your help for this nation of Scotland, for this United Kingdom. Father, we are grieved that your name is not honoured as it should be, for you are such a God of grace and mercy. We thank you for those of us who found our salvation in the Lord Jesus Christ through trusting in his death upon the cross to take away our sins and his resurrection that gives us new life. Well, Lord, we thank you for the hope that gives us, and we pray, Lord, that you would continue to help and strengthen those who govern us. We thank you for the way that they are willing to serve us in this way. We recognize it is a thankless task with great difficulties. We pray for the Queen, for the Prime Minister, for the First Minister, for the government, both in Westminster and Holyrood. Lord, we ask that you continue to strengthen them in their work, that they would do so with integrity and righteousness and justice. Father, we want to thank you for the freedoms we enjoy, and we ask that you would continue to bless us as a nation as we approach this referendum debate, that we would be able to engage with each other in such a way that whatever the outcome the next day, that we can recognize each other as fellow citizens and do good for one another. Father, we ask you continue to enable us to have gospel freedoms, of freedom of speech in this nation, a peaceful nation where we would have the right and privilege to continue to share the gospel, and those that dissent can do so the same. Lord, we pray for an open marketplace of ideas, a freedom to be able to convert, to change our minds. Lord, we ask you would give us these freedoms. Father, we thank you for this night, and we pray that you'd keep us safe as we head to our homes this evening. In Christ's precious name, amen.